and part of this lecture series. We're very happy to have you here today. Um, and just to begin with, I'll introduce Work Fair and Free and what this lecture series is all about. Work Fair and Free is a new knowledge institution. We are based out of Bangalore, and we've been incubated by a long-standing labor rights organization called Ajivika Bureau, which has been present in the labor space for almost 2 decades now. Ajivika Bureau has a long presence in the Western Migration Corridor largely, and Work Fair and Free works along with Ajivika Bureau as well as conducts independent research and knowledge inquiries across different geographies and migration corridors, both rural and urban. And most of our research inquiries are sort of drawn from the lived experiences and realities of migrant workers, both in rural locations as well as urban destinations. So that's broadly what our work is. And our thematic focus is around mapping different migration corridors, looking at occupational safety and health issues, thinking about the intersection of migration and climate change, between labor and urban governance. So these are broad areas in which we work. And this lecture series is more to further these conversations and to keep looking at the intersection between migration and labor, and have sort of be in constant dialogue with academic spaces, policy organizations, as well as labor practitioners in the country. So the forum is also open to different sort of audiences to participate and engage in this conversation. Gender and work is again a very important area of research and conversation for us, and we are hoping that today's talk will sort of push that forward for us. We've been doing some work along these lines, both as of now as well as in the past. Some of our current inquiries are around looking at the intersection of technology, gender, and labor, where we're studying the impact of automation on women construction workers in Ahmedabad. There's a very interesting study that's being done by team members in Rajasthan, looking at young women and particularly adolescent girls and their work in construction and mines, and are trying to understand what is their laboring experience in these sectors, looking at the intersection between adolescence, sexuality, and how it intersects with the labor market. So we're really hoping that this talk will also sort of further these conversations we are having internally as well as in our research. And Professor Mary perhaps doesn't need introduction for a lot of us who are from the women's studies and gender studies space, but she's a well-known feminist scholar, and some of her research and writing are foundational texts in classroom for women's studies and gender studies programs in India. As I said, she's retired from the Center for Women's Development Studies. She's been the director there as well as the deputy director of the Women's Studies program in JNU. Her scholarship is broadly in the areas of migration, family, labor, and education, as well as writings on feminist theory. Again, one of the very fantastic things about Professor Mary is that she's able to transform something that looks very familiar or commonsensical into the unfamiliar, and sort of puts it to scrutiny and closer look and investigation. Some of her books have been very valuable, and we've learned quite a bit from those. Question of Silence or the Women's Studies Reader, like I said, have been very seminal texts we all go back to very often to look at the debates around sexuality and a whole range of issues, particularly the Women's Studies Reader. More recent work on women in the worlds of labor, again from an interdisciplinary and intersectional perspective, has also been important, where a whole range of essays were brought together that even highlighted or provided insights into issues that are missing in mainstream labor discourses and movements. So it sort of brought together a whole lot of issues and perspectives. Today's talk is basically looking at, it's very intriguingly titled Marriage is Work, Problematizing Education, Labor, and Child Marriage in India. So I'm also looking forward to Professor Mary unpacking marriages work for us. And some maybe we are also, I'll sort of present a couple of questions that uh, we hope that we'll have some discussion around both through the talk as well as after the presentation. For example, we are often concerned with the declining female labor force participation in India, and it's one of the lowest in the world, right? How does marriage or age of marriage intersect with this declining labor force participation? Is perhaps one question that we could think about, and perhaps Professor Mary will help us tease through. The other is what are the connections or dissonances between increasing higher education and declining labor force participation? And then why? How does marriage sort of become a central institution connecting labor and education? So these perhaps will be the questions that will be discussed through this presentation. And we're very happy to have you here, Professor Mary. The floor is open to you.
Thank you, Geeta, for that. For first of all, sharing some of the work that you do, and for that very nice introduction. I'm very happy to be here and excited because I hope I will learn. I realize I'm coming at the topic of labor and migration from a somewhat different angle, and I will be emphasizing aspects that may not seem to have a direct relevance, but I'm hoping that precisely through interaction and through conversation, some of those connections and disconnections, because this is, I think, part of the problem that in fact, I found even in my own study, that there are so many disconnects or so many assumptions that don't hold up when you actually enter the field. May I ask for the PPT to be mounted? Can it be in full screen mode? Thank you. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so I hope this is clear. Everyone can read it. I will just be using it as a reference point in any case and speaking somewhat freely. The purpose of this study that I'm going to be speaking about is a kind of effort to be an intervention in a context, 21st century context, where there is a global, a new global focus on what is called child marriage. Child marriage is defined as anyone below the age of 18. You may be 17 years and 11 months and so many days, but if you're not 18, then you're a child. You're a woman is a child as per international law. So this is the fact, the prevalence of such marriages, child marriages across the globe has become a huge focus internationally, globally. Agencies are putting in a lot of money at this point towards its eradication, and it has been called a harmful. UN language says this is a harmful practice that must be eradicated. In India, we have seen a lot of efforts on the ground in efforts to delay age at marriage, including laws, including using, in fact, the most prominent mode is, I feel, unfortunately, legal. So, in fact, the government of India not so long ago even wanted to raise the minimum age at marriage. I don't know how much of you were part of that, noticed that effort. They wanted to raise the minimum age at marriage of women from 18 to 21. Redefine a child as anyone below the age of 21. That seems to have lapsed. It hasn't come through. Some of us had, in fact, organized against that move, that criminalization was not a step forward. In Karnataka, here in Karnataka, there has been a move to declare such marriages void. Not just voidable, but void, which means that they are basically illegal, and so on. So these have been the most prominent ways in which efforts to curb it have been And my own focus has been quite different. I have not looked at the legal aspects of it. I have not examined, case law. I have been looking, and the study itself focuses on young women in the early years of their marriage. That is to say, we conducted our study, our survey, our interviews, and so on with young women in the first 10 years of their marriage, regardless of age. I'll say more about the regions and so on. And where I have made education, work, and marriage the central foci of my study. Next slide, please. So I will jump over this very quickly, only to say that historically, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the social reform period of the 19th century into the early 20th century during the colonial period. At that time, child marriage, the discovery and the nomenclature child marriage was one of the most central features of social reform. And there were huge campaigns and huge contestations. Major, even early nationalism found itself in conflict with the issue. I won't dwell on it too much, simply by way of a contrast to say that what had once been a huge issue, a huge matter of controversy, recedes from view after independence. And aged marriage has been, from 10 to 12, 12 to 14, these were some of the big moments historically. Post-emergency, age at marriage is fixed at 18 for women and 21 for boys, for men. And that shift, that increase in minimum ages did not invite any kind of repercussions. There were no reactions to it whatsoever. And its ostensible framing, and that I think is very interesting, whereas in the colonial period, it was in terms of the rights and wrongs of women, and all of those were the churning issues, and nationalism, opposing many nationalists, some nationalists, opposing all these in the name of Indian, the Indian womanhood should not be the subject of reform as a cultural symbol. This was the terrain in the colonial period, but in the post-independence period, it shifts entirely. It becomes part of development discourse, and not just development discourse, I should say, but population control discourse. So the objects and reasons for raising the age in 1978 was to curb population control, because the claim was the higher the age at marriage, the lower the fertility. So it's a very, very different mode of approach. And as I have argued, one of the ways we understand this shift is, whereas in the colonial period, the focus was on the self. That is to say, the middle classes themselves were reforming themselves. Upper caste, urban middle classes, the emergent new middle class was central to the social reform effort. They have changed. They have moved forward in the period up to their ages, their schooling, their work. These are all very fascinating. How did this change? But over this period, their family practices, their marriage practices transformed, and the problem was seen to reside no longer here, but what I'm calling the others, the backward regions, the poor, the marginalized groups, and so on. They were the source of the problem, and it was a very new focus. Therefore, so in the immediate years of post-independence, they retreated from view. They were no longer really central to until the 21st century. Next slide, please. So it's in the 21st century that there is a revival. From its having been relatively dormant, there is a revival. And in the wake of international covenants and so on, the rights of the child. And in the Indian context, this is what I have found, that whereas the international focus is entirely demographic, looking at certain kinds of numbers, we don't have comparative studies, comparable studies from sociology, from anthropology, education, labor, gender, sexuality. These were not spheres out of which the new studies were coming. At the time when I envisaged my study, there was very little happening by way of research. There was a lot of intervention on the ground, and talk of delaying marriages, stopping marriages. But if you actually asked for information, data, understanding, there was very little to fall back on. And the kind of relationships, the complex relationships between marriage, poverty, education, sexuality, but none of these seem to be in the mix in what I could see around me when this study began. In fact, what was particularly troubling to me was to see a lot of certain kinds of studies which made the case that child marriage was the root cause of various negative consequences. Health of the mother, health of the child, her lack of education, any number of employment, you name it, you could, into nutrition, you could just put a whole list of ills whose root cause was the fact that the woman had married too soon and had a pregnancy too soon. And I found that this kind of arguments were very specious. They did not recognize the complexity of the issue, that child marriage itself is a consequence, not just a cause, but a consequence itself of many other factors, and cannot be sort of isolated in the way it was being attempted. And especially the way in which then legal and to some extent policy. So the legal measures like the Prevention of Child Marriages Act that I mentioned, or raising the age, these seem to be the primary, because if you make child marriage the principal cause of various ills, then it seems like the solution, the only real solution, is to raise the age, right? And that's what I mean, we can discuss that. That's precisely what I was able to show does not hold. That if everything else remains the same and you only raise the age at marriage, the woman's future, her health, the health of her children really do not undergo any appreciable change whatsoever. So this legal focus, and to some extent a policy focus with conditional cash transfer schemes, were the only measures one could see on the ground. Next slide, please. So I saw the need, therefore, to reframe the problem as it was being posed. I do not believe that there is that certain communities or certain regions suffer from this social norm called child marriage, and which is cultural problem which has to be corrected through legal means. I believe that it is part and parcel of the way marriage as such in India has historically and to this very day is reproducing itself as a compulsory institution. And when I say compulsory institution, I don't mean force. I think it's very important. I think all of you know this so only too well in the labor and migration, the ease with which certain kinds of movements are seen as coerced or otherwise problematic. When I say compulsory, I mean that it's near universal, that it's hegemonic, and that it is the future of practically all women in our country to this very day. It's not something we think about too much, but it is actually the one thing that sets us apart from most other parts of the world, including Asian countries. So I see what I would rather call early marriage rather than child marriage, early marriage as being the underside. So what is the practice today? The fact is that age at marriage has been slowly increasing. I'll show you a slide shortly. The proportion of those marrying below 18 has been slowly declining. But compulsory marriage, the fact that marriage of whatever nature, arranged or so-called love marriages, this continues. There has been no reduction in the fact that this is the future. And I believe that early marriages are the underbelly of the fact that we have what I call compulsory marriage. The early marriages are better. The so-called child marriages, I would rather, since they actually, they concentrate in the 15 to 17 age group. It's no longer the image you might have in your minds of, Rajasthan with little babies being, married off. This is the image we carry to this very day of child marriage. This is no longer, in fact, in prevalence. These are anomalies to the extent to which they exist any longer. It's not children. It's rather young adolescents, not so young, in fact. 15 to 17 would be considered a middle or older adolescent. The grouping is there. It is here that about 26% or 23, I think, as per NFHS 5, the National Family Health Survey 5, it's about 23% nationally are marrying below the age of 18, 15 to 17. So let's call them early marriages or adolescent marriages. And that's so my claim is, let us reintegrate this phenomenon, this changing phenomenon, with marriage as such and its practice and its characteristics. Next slide, please. So here you can see where this is a using census data from 1901 to the last census that we've had is 2011. You can see the graph. This is the mean age at marriage. And you can see from what level 13 it has been steadily going up. There was a little dip in 1931. This is a very curious little dip because this was just at the time when the Sharda Act was to be enacted. That was when age at marriage was being raised from 12 to 14. So it's a very interesting moment of, the huge moment of crisis for the Indian nation to be. And many people were rushing to marry off their children below the age of 14 just before this act was coming into effect. So you actually see a dip. Otherwise, it's been steadily going up. It's about 20 point. This is the average age at marriage in our country, 20.8. Next slide, please. So this I've also just given you very quickly to look. This is telling you the absolute number of married women in terms of age, the age distribution of married women. I thought this was curious. It was interesting to do something like this because you would imagine that there would be a kind of neat sort of pattern to it. But as you can see, there is no neat pattern. And in fact, there are jumps. So notice the jump from 17 to 18, 15, 16, 17, the bars are quite low, the numbers are small. It jumps to 18, which is the official minimum age at marriage. So there's a question there, is this a genuine jump? People are waiting till 18 to marry? Or is there some fudging going on, perhaps misreporting? The other interesting thing I thought you might find interesting is that there's a jump at 20, there's another jump at 25. So this also tells you that age in our country is a very complex, and I'm sure even in your own work, this has come up. What is age? What meaning does age have? When people report their age, to what extent are do they know? Is it a meaningful thing? Is it something they accurately report, or is it just the fact that we have these jumps implies that people think in terms of either 20s, 30s, 40s, or 25, 35. So there's a tendency to give your age as 20, 25, 30, if in fact you have not got an accurate sense of age. Next slide. Okay, so this gives you, and this I would be curious to know from your work. These are patterns of prevalence of underage marriage below the age of 18. The darker the green, the higher the prevalence, and the lighter the color, the less the prevalence. So I do not know how this matches with you talked about corridors of migration. Do you have corridors on an all India level? Do you have them at a much more local level? Does it make sense to connect the two or not? I'm very curious because I have no idea. But there's a strong concentration, let me say, in the West, that is, and mainly the state of Rajasthan, not only, but mainly the state of Rajasthan and some of the surrounding districts. There is a strong focus in the East. West Bengal is now the #1 state, of which many people don't even realize. They don't think of West Bengal as a state with early age at marriage, but it is. And along with the neighboring Bihar and a little bit in the Northeast. And in the South, it is Andhra and Telangana, which have relatively high prevalence of early marriages. Next slide. Okay, this is just, again, this is another, just quickly, just to give you idea of changing trends in early marriage and this is using the National Family Health Survey. The first survey was in 1992-93. NFHS 5, the most recent one, was during the COVID years, 2021. And the black line is all India, and three states, these were the states within which I did my field work. Rajasthan, West Bengal, and Telangana, which is of course a newly created state. So some of the data is Andhra Pradesh. So here you can see how there are variations. A state like Rajasthan, interestingly, from having had the highest rates of early marriage, is now has declined considerably. And contrast that with Bengal, where it has been a bit of an up and down and hasn't changed as much as the others have. Others are converging to the national average, whereas Bengal continues to be on the higher side. Next slide. So the study, again, let me move quickly because otherwise we lose time. Simply to say that I chose, as I mentioned, from the three east, west, south to get regional variation. I chose Rajasthan in the west, West Bengal in the east, and Telangana in the south as my study sites. And within those, the rural district, Murshidabad in West Bengal, Sabai Madhopur in Rajasthan, and Mahbubnagar in Telangana. And along with those, we also did some field work in the respective urban capitals. That is Kolkata, Jaipur, and Hyderabad, because we didn't want it to be a standalone, even though those are obviously not low. Those are obviously low prevalence sites. Nonetheless, we wanted to have a kind of balance looking at slum as well as middle class. We also sort of sampled the middle classes so that we could actually sample marriage in a more comprehensive way rather than only isolate those who married early, to look at comparisons and differences. Next slide. So now let me begin. So these are my primary sites for us to think with. So in terms of the national data, if you want to ask ourselves at what point, with what level, because I don't know how it is in the labor and migration discourses, but in discourses here around early marriage, or what they still call child marriage, the solution to all problems is education. More education and the problem would be solved. Now, if you were to look at levels of education in relationship to age at marriage, which you can only do with National Family Health Survey, we have very few. Unfortunately, most of our data sets do not give us age at marriage. And this is a problem. This means that our capacity to use national data is limited. Census does give it, but then census now is also rather dated and takes very long to come out. I imagine that you have similar problems with migration data. So NSS data, for instance, which otherwise would be very valuable, gives you otherwise a lot of information, does not report age at marriage. So if we look at NFHS data and correlate the levels of education and age at marriage, then marriage below 18 only really disappears beyond high school, beyond secondary education. So it's only when a young girl, a young woman enters college or some post-high school degree that age at marriage reporting shows 18 or above. So so think about this. So elementary education, high school, at these ages of 14, ages of 16, and so on, you finish your schooling in your own area, and then you may be, for lack of anything else, you may be married. So these would all then count as underage marriage. So we asked many questions to the young women about their education, their childhood experiences, why they stopped, and there was considerable variation. But what we were struck by was that most of them had only, outside of the middle class, urban middle classes, the modal level of education was only middle school, was elementary education, that is age 14. So that is what was available in their areas. Many of them spoke with great regret, saying they wish they could have studied more. At the time, they may not have been, there was either no school close by, or they had no interest at the time, they dropped out, and so on. And I feel, therefore, that we need to rethink because the conventional discourse always says parents are responsible for early marriages. They pull out their daughters from their schools and marry them off. Instead, they should be allowed to study further. This data would tell us a somewhat different story of education failing women, basically, that there is not much available. What is available, they may or may not connect to. Many of them show disinterest. We need to ask ourselves, what is this disinterest? Some of them had financial constraints, a range of constraints. It was only in one district, that is Murshidabad, that many of them said they stopped their education because they were going to be married. Otherwise, this was not the dominant reason given at the time when they stopped their marriage. And in fact, what is curious, and we'll talk about this at the very end, many of them said it was their choice. They used that kind of, they said they took it as their responsibility. They didn't say it was my condition. They didn't say it was the poverty of unless it was extremely, very extreme forms of poverty. They said it was my choice to end my education. That also left us with many questions in our minds. Next slide. So work, which is very rarely, I will say this, very rarely does work figure in any studies on early or child marriage. And many of these things which are assumed to have a cultural reason for their existence, nobody even bothers to enter the question of what is women's work. What do they do? What kind of jobs do they have? What are jobs would they want to have? How do they spend their time? We don't find these studies being taken in this context. They may happen in other contexts where labor is the focus, but they don't happen here. And what we found was that unpaid work was the prominent, not a surprise at all. Unpaid work was the most prominent form of work for them. That meant domestic work or extended domestic work from morning till night with some amount of rest in the afternoon, and coupled with some amount of paid work in small numbers. Small numbers of women in the early years of their marriages are working for pay, for some kind of remuneration. They are otherwise, and this labor at home that they perform, and that's interesting into contrast with that sudden phrase, that title of my talk, Marriage is Work, was something that many women said to us in the context of talking about what their marriages meant to them. But when we ask them to actually talk about the work that they do, what do they do when they get up in the morning? What do they do? And so on over the course of the day. They were very surprised by this question, and they didn't think that they were very taken aback and had not given it much thought. The fact that they have to spend all this time doing the work that they do, the intermittent level, kinds of work or unpaid work, the ranges of domestic work, of cooking, cleaning, caring for animals, and the child care for many of them, or elder care. All these were woven to each other as part of the day of labor, which was taken for granted. This was not something that was worthy of mention. This was certainly not something that gave them any sense of achievement. And again, we asked, who helps you in your work, in this unpaid work? Who is there to help you from family or others? Some middle-class women in urban contexts had domestic workers, paid domestic workers. These are absent entirely in the rural areas that we were studying. So there was some amount, mothers-in-law, sisters-in-law, husbands to some extent, occasionally. Very rarely, husbands really did not figure very much in this daily routine. Those who are married at younger ages had more responsibilities. This was again a surprising finding for us. We would imagine that perhaps a younger woman could expect more, like she wouldn't be burdened right off, but other older female family members or whoever would be there for her, but not so. In fact, they had more burden, they had less help than did those who married at later ages. There were hardly any, especially in the rural regions, these, I don't know if you're familiar with Murshidabad, Mahbubnagar, Savai Madhavpur. These are not regions These are high out migration regions, all of them, very few work opportunities. And in many of them in Bengal, for instance, none of them claim that there were differences. These are definite regional differences where women say they do not engage in any kind of agricultural work. This was what was said in Murshidabad. By contrast, in Mahbubnagar, yes, considerable numbers of those and it included both underage, both those marrying early as well as above 18. Poorer families were engaged in agricultural work, either on their own as cultivators, helping in cultivation, or actually engaged in agricultural work in other fields. Seasonal migration, therefore, in the absence of other opportunities, seasonal migrant work was therefore a source of livelihood. Husbands may be leaving on their own. Sometimes they left on their own. When we would visit, husbands would have left, gone to Hyderabad, Bombay, or wherever the city may have been. And they were there, or they had gone with them. So it varied. But since my study, unfortunately, was not a migrant study, I can't give you data. I wish I could give you more data on these. But this is to say that these are regions where locally there are practically no work opportunities, and therefore husbands are engaged in seasonal, usually construction work. In the urban sites, of course, there are a range from the poor to the middle classes. That's a very different kind of situation in terms of what work was available. But at low levels of work, there was no question about the fact that there were low levels of work available at all, even including at the higher levels of the middle classes. But again, a very surprising finding for us was we asked women what work they had before their marriages and what work they had after. And the biggest drop in work was not amongst the poor, but was amongst the middle classes. It is the middle classes, those with graduate and above levels of education, who may have been working before in some capacity, who were then, quote unquote, housewives after marriage. Whereas poorer families who had to work, where the women had to be part of some kind of workforce, where the work continued, especially in Mahbubnagar, where agricultural labor continued after marriage in the new family home. So this is true, by the way. You may ask how representative is the field data. We did, after all, relatively small samples in these villages and so on. How does it compare with national level data? Yes, it's a fact, a very surprising and shocking fact, but one that actually should be known more, that women at higher ages of marriage are working less in terms of paid work, are working less and have probably more assistance in terms of unpaid work than do others in terms of domestic help. So when people say that the solution to the problem is a higher age at marriage and so on, nobody puts this kind of data onto the table and says, how does that square? If you want a solution in terms of, if you think that better employment opportunities are going to come someone's way with a higher age at marriage, then how do you square it with this kind of data? Next slide. So marriage, when we came to marriage, we asked them a lot of questions around marriage. And what we discovered was that they often they came out with almost not contradictory, but rather a different angle onto questions that we had asked them earlier. So women, when we asked about what are the qualifications for a good husband in a marriage, they would always say, good education, good job prospects, and so on and so forth. But when we actually looked at it closely, we discovered that husbands did not have better in fact, in some instances, husbands' education levels were less than those of their wives, right? So remember that the median sort of modal age at marriage, educational levels were elementary education for girls. And with our usual idea of a good marriage is that the husband should be then more educated, but this was not so. There could be illiteracy in the husband. There could be low levels of schooling in the husband. And some of these mismatches, if I may call them that, even persisted in the middle classes, where it was not always the case that the husband had a better level of education than the wife. The wife might have a degree, an MA degree or whatever that the husband did not have. So we need to look very closely when we have this, standard view of the good, what is a good marriage, what are the good qualifications of a husband, which are trotted out almost automatically, and what actually happens. In fact, when it came to a husband, then in the end, some financial security was the most important criterion beyond everything else. But even those did not hold up in so many situations where the claim was that, yes, we found a good family, financial insecurity, migration, and so on were the actual realities that we discovered. And it is in this context, when we were discussing their marriages and their lives, that they came out. Many of them said, marriage, this is their phrase, not ours. Marriage is work. Because we were looking for maybe, romantic views on marriage, maybe happiness in marriage, maybe joy in having babies and childhood and so on. But at least in this stage in their lives, and I think this is a very important stage in a young woman's life, the early years of her marriage. These were not the prominent, romantic ideas were not prominent. Sexuality hardly figured in their claims about what their lives were like. Instead, this was what they said, that they were burdened by the lives that they were entering, and some of them called it torture. Some of them used the word torture, or rather, I mean, we've translated it as the equivalent word in Telugu or in Bengali or in Hindi. And this came from different sites. Torture. So torture in the new family was what they experienced. And I believe that therefore, and this is something that struck me as I was preparing this for your series, is that the experience of marriage for women is an experience of migration. They are moving from a natal family to whatever the new context may be, with or without in-laws. They are moving to a new home. This is an experience of migration. In big cities like Kolkata, they may be marrying someone close by. It may be a few, down the road, a few kilometers away, maybe, right? Those are rare, but those are in urban contexts. It's possible you marry in the same city. This is not happening in rural areas. Even when you're marrying perhaps someone who is a relative, as in South India, as in Mahbubnagar, you are nonetheless moving away. So this experience of migration of these young women is an experience of work as a burden. This is what I want to sort of put out, and I would love to hear from you how you see this experience of, comparing it with other experiences of migration, which are often thought of as distress migration and so on. But these early years of marriage are such that they often tend to, and maybe this is also, their own fictional imaginations, they look back then at the years in their natal family as years of happiness, of childhood, of being carefree, of having fun. And this is the time when they're laden with burdensome work. And if anything, it's because of this, when we ask them what is the right age at marriage, all of them have internalized the idea that 18 is the correct age at marriage. This is now widespread. Even women who may not know what their age is will tell you 18 is the right age at marriage. And delaying, and they will also tell you that no, the doctors scold them and what have you, and there are laws out there that will punish you if you marry too early and so on. But when push comes to shove, the real reason they said we should delay marriage is because it is torture. Let us delay those years of burden and those years of torture when we enter into the new household. So this is what, this is the kind of, entangled nature of marriage, migration, and work that is the lot of large proportions, and not just those who marry too soon, large proportions of rural women for sure, and of some urban women too. Next slide. So women were only too happy. As I said, we wanted to did not want to sound like we were only getting a very one-sided picture. We asked them about love marriages, arranged marriages, and so on, which is so, which kind of saturates, you could say, popular culture, and so on. So this was a this was a topic they were very happy to speak about. As it so happens, in terms of the patterns, women choosing their own self-choice, whatever we want to call them, marriages, elopements, they have various names, are actually quite prevalent in Bengal. Again, a surprise. This is not including rural Bengal. It is part of the social fabric of rural Bengal. Young people, running away to the nearest Kali temple and so on, eloping and then coming back and finding relative levels of acceptability. Even when caste and so on have been somewhat breached, these are mostly across lower castes, sometimes even higher. The only time when we came across real tension was if it was across religion, Hindu, Muslim. That was a no-no. But otherwise, it was not the kind of, we have an image of Haryana type, families, violently opposed to any kind of normative, infringement. This is not the story in Bengal, and this is the state which has relatively and very curiously, again, I don't think we know enough about this. Not that the majority, but yes, a distinct number were marrying, especially in urban Kolkata, were marrying out of choice. Otherwise, the numbers are very small. It's quote unquote arranged marriage. And this enjoys widespread approval. So women, when asked about this, said, yes, the only way to have a good marriage is to go by family choice, whether it's in terms of caste, in terms of they know best, whether or not they know best, it's the only way, because if you choose on your own, you are going to live a life of isolation. You are going to be without family support. This is not viable. Therefore, arranged marriage is the only way. And I put this there, and this again is not something that was said only by the very young or by those who had married at older ages. It was said across the spectrum, and continues therefore to be the structure of marriage to this very day. And this is something, again, maybe I'm saying something that is obvious to some of us, but we need to reflect on this a little more, because this is unique to in the world. The fact that arranged marriages continue to be the basic structure across ages for the future of young people. That is to say, it's an intergenerational contract that is being carried out, if in effect, to this very day. And I think until and unless we put in the low and declining, what Geeta talked about, the low and declining levels of employment for women, if that is the reality of the 21st century, and the levels of education, then we can see why and how marriage becomes the future, the economic, social, sexual, reproductive future of the majority, not the majority, or practically everyone, a practically universal institution. Therefore, you buy into therefore caste and other community type norms are put into play as the viable way to ensure some levels of stability in what would otherwise be an isolating experience. There is a common discourse in all these sites that if you don't marry in time, whatever that in time might be, then women will make their own choices and so on. And that this has to be avoided at all costs because it's a disastrous future. Therefore, one has to marry in time as per family wishes. This was the dominant discourse that we heard. So let me just make next slide some concluding so that we can have a discussion. So these are some of the points that I think we need to think about. I won't spend too much time on them. Age, this strong singular focus on we have to delay age at marriage, I believe needs to be questioned. We need to look at adolescent marriages for what they are. Ask ourselves, what are the factors that are promoting that in certain regions, which are characterized by poverty, by low levels of education, and so on. Marriage as migration is something I would like us to think about, and the connections between education, work, and marriage. I would like to say that a whole range of factors, not so much culture and social norms, are involved in the patterns of marriage that we have to this very day. The fact that in certain regions, high numbers are marrying below 18 is not because of their culture so much as because of their lack of resources, the vulnerability they experience, which leads them to then go into a marriage earlier rather than later. And this agency that at least in feminist discourses, there's a lot of talk of agency, and even in child marriage, interventions, women's agency, much is made of that. Here, I want to just simply say that we were surprised by the way in which the women themselves talked about their own agency. They said that they took responsibility of the fact that they ended their education when they did. They ascribed too much agency, if I may say so. I mean, they only said that it was a problem if it was, some family tragedy or extreme poverty. Otherwise, they said it was their own agency. They gave no agency to their work. The unpaid labors that they did all day long was not a source of agency for themselves. And finally, when it came to sexuality and marriage, as we saw, they did not approve of sexual agency. They did not approve of the idea that you could, find a spouse, have a boyfriend, and marry him. This did not find approval here. So let me stop here. I'm sorry I've taken too long to leave some time for discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mary, for that very wonderful presentation and taking us through a range of issues. I will not take any time to summarize what you've said. We'll open the floor right away for questions. I see a hand up. Could you please ask a question? And the others could also either ask questions personally or write it on the chat.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the session. It was a great learning session as well. I am particularly very much interested when we are talking about Murshidabad, because it's just because my partner also works there in Murshidabad. There's an organization CINI which works there, and they are extensively working on the part of public health. And your data is perfectly saying the right thing, because it's also supporting the point that mother who have died while giving childbirth is now the highest. The ratio is now highest in West Bengal. It's just a yesterday report in Anand Bazar, that paper. So basically what I just wanted to quickly ask you, that we have seen a very paradoxical pattern in West Bengal, that there are a huge number of women workers, those who are going to Gurgaon, Delhi, or even coming to Mumbai, going to Bangalore and working as a domestic help. On the other hand, it is also true, a place like Murshidabad, where we can see this kind of adolescent marriage and this huge public health issue as well. Also the marriage as work, which you have rightly described. So there, one assumption which I was somewhat making, that it could be the religion, because the minority groups are the highest in case of Murshidabad. And obviously the education there, level of development is the least in these pockets. And obviously they have very huge number of children at the age of 20, 21. Sometimes they have 3 or 4 children. So this have you seen this mosaic while you have done the field work, that based on the region, based on the caste or religion, this pattern of women participation in the informal work also changes? Because we know that this exists. Also, there's a huge number of household help we see who are Bengalis and settled in Mumbai after migration in last 40 years, last 30 years. I've also had a chance to interview them recently in Mumbai. So that's why I just wanted to understand your experience,
Yeah.
your insights.
Mary, should select a couple of questions, or would you like to answer one by one?
No, I can do it either way, whatever you suggest. Maybe I'll just take one by one.
Maybe one by one. Okay.
Because I might lose my thread otherwise. So,
Sure.
yeah. So thank you for your question, Murshidabad. Very fascinating. Yes, you're right that the district as a whole has a high proportion of Muslim population. However, when we did our study, we wanted to make sure that we got equal amounts of Hindu groups from different castes, and the patterns are no different. So we should be very careful. I think this is a very important issue. Now, I don't mean to say that there are not variations, that, they may, but we have to watch out whether we think that because it's a Muslim majority area, therefore this is the reason. All India averages will show you that underage marriages are as prevalent amongst Hindus as they are amongst Muslims. However, there's a way in which, and this is a very complicated but problematic thing, we saw it in Assam recently with the crackdown on underage marriages that was initiated by the chief minister a year ago, that there is a tendency to believe that the target population is Muslim. But actually it's not so. In any case, what we need to understand better are the multiple causes of underage marriages. Why are these happening? These are happening because these are poorer families with less education, with less resources, whose vulnerabilities then take the form of marriage sooner rather than later. It is only at higher levels of wealth, higher levels of education, that the system, the marriage market changes, and therefore your marriages are happening later. This also includes Muslim families. More educated. But because Muslims are on the whole poorer, they are poor, right? They are poorer, and they are therefore more disadvantaged in socio-economic terms, which in turn translates into the fact that they marry sooner, right? And then so again, the question of health. Health is a consequence of their poverty, of being in situations of malnutrition, rather than to say that they are the cause of the ill health of the mother or child is early marriage. I have shown that if you actually delay marriage, you can do a regression kind of analysis to try and disaggregate different forms of causes. If you were to leave everything the same, the health is, the healthcare system, the nutritional levels, whatever else, the poverty levels and so on of the situation, if they don't change, and a woman delays her marriage from 18 to 21, very little changes in terms of her health or the health of her child. She doesn't become healthier just by delaying. This is the very important thing, because why are higher ages at marriage associated with better health? Because they are wealthier families, because they have better health care, and so on. So, that's why I'm saying this complexity of the factors and their relationship to each other is what is missed out. And it becomes very easy to isolate the age factor compared to all the others. And that's what is happening in states like Murshidabad, and in particular where you have a Muslim majority. Same thing is true in Assam. Same thing is true in, say, the old city of Hyderabad. All these are pockets or areas where you have more Muslims, and it's easy to isolate. Whereas in Rajasthan, where the Muslim population is very small, has been the home of baby marriages historically, right? So, how do we square all these? So I think that's why and national data will not support it. There will be pockets where, yes, the proportion of Muslims are more, there are more early marriages happening there. But once you disaggregate those, again, the picture will change. So this is my answer to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Miri. Thanks a lot. In fact, you're very right in case of Rajasthan also. When I used to work with Divya, and hi Divya, we did a work in Kushalgarh, Banswara at Losen Children. And we saw this same issue that they were getting married at the age of 14. But just very quickly, I just wanted to confirm that you're saying that just delaying the marriage will not only solve the issue of the health and the entire condition. Right. Thank you so much. Hi Nisarg, hi Bhakti. I'll quickly just log off. Yeah.
Any more questions? Please either you can ask directly or put it on the chat box.
Thank you, Mary, for that insightful talk. Uh, I just wanted to add to the question that Shilajit kind of asked here, because if we look at the NHFS 5 data, and especially like unit level data across different caste subgroups and religion subgroups, we see that the prevalence of child marriage or early child marriage is there, but it's kind of declining right now versus what we've been finding in from our field experiences. So, did you also come across this in your study, or what are some of the factors that kind of contribute to this pattern? So, yeah.
So ours was a single point in time study, not a longitudinal study. So you would need a longitudinal study, I think, to be able to answer that properly. And ours was only one point in time. We did our study around just before COVID, 17, 18. See, I think there is you could say a long-term trend. You would say there is a push, that there is a slow push as a and you can look at the contributing factors in terms of maybe education, in terms of beliefs and so on, and pressures that say that 18 is a better age, hoping upward mobility, hopes for upward mobility to that you wait in the hopes that you might get a better partner and so on. Those kinds of negotiations between families. We don't really know. There is no simple answer worldwide. This is a worldwide trend, right? Early marriages, so-called child marriages were the norm universally across the world, and changed in the last century or two. This is the last century or two that changes have been happening. And you could say this is a kind of secular trend consequent upon modernization, industry. So how does it actually happen in a certain set of years, even between NFHS 4 and 5? There is a slight decline, not so much in Bengal. Bengal seems to be stagnating. And that's, if you recall my graph, Bengal did not show that much variation compared to elsewhere, and it's not entirely clear why. But I will say this, that women in Bengal, the previous person had been saying that, yes, there are those who work, who leave, who migrate, and and we all know large numbers of domestic workers who come from Bengal, and which is looking for work elsewhere. But the attitude towards work in Bengal, women working, even unlike Rajasthan, you will find women working in the fields in Rajasthan. You will not find that in Bengal. You will find in Bengal home-based work. The beadi rolling, some of the most onerous, worst forms of home-based work you will find in Bengal, or kata stitching. These are sort of some of the home-based industries you will find in Bengal. But women working actually in the fields is not something you will see. So there are these variations, I think, that we need to understand, within which there is this pull upwards. I would call it a pull upwards, a slow, and we have to see how much further it will go. I think it will slowly go. That's what I'm saying. In maybe another 10 years, we will find that it has really declined even further. Is no longer this massive problem that we think it is. But the fact that it has declined further should not give us the satisfaction. This is my worry, that it should not give us the satisfaction that the problems associated with it, the problems of ill health, poverty, lack of nutrition, lack of opportunities, and so on. If we thought that if in future, in the next so many years now, age-ed marriage is going to creep upwards and underage marriage is going to decline further, that this will solve the problems around it, then I think we are kidding ourselves. And I think that is absolutely not true. And that's what worries me, because so long as the institution of marriage, dependency, lack of worth of any kind of unpaid work, low levels of employment, and so on, so long as these continue to be the reality in our context, then we're going to see the corresponding patterns amongst those who are less well endowed compared to others. And that will include ill health, that will include lack of nutrition, and so on. And by the way, fertility is going down. So it's no longer the old population kind of mantra. Even in states like Bengal, very low levels of fertility. So very poor families are, again, for reasons we don't have like ready-made answers for those. But we are seeing low levels of fertility almost everywhere, with one or two exceptions. So we're entering the phase of replacement level fertility in our country. And how do we understand that? How do we understand that in spite of the fact that poverty remains? These are all difficult questions for which I don't think I have answers, but we should recognize these patterns in the first place. Thank you.
Thanks.
Taraman, do you want to go next? And then there's a question in the chat box. I'll read out after Taraman.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I have a couple of, sorry, I am not showing my face because my camera is too bad. I have a kind of couple of questions. Question number one is, I was very quite curious to know how easy it was for you to talk to adolescent girls. Because my own work among adolescent girls tells me that they have this I say that silence is a strategic weapon. Because, they have a lot to lose by speaking out. So, it's about their aspirations, about marriage, or about several things. Violence against them, or, their public place experiences. Generally, they take a very sort of calculated sort of a thing of not to say anything, because I understand that, because they know there are a lot to lose if they say, and that word spreads, and then their whatever little freedom they enjoy would be. So I just, as a methodological sort of point, I was wondering how what kind of tools you use to talk to them. Number two, we generally talk about this double movement of detraditionalization versus, at the same time, there's a movement toward traditionalization in a very Polanyian sense. I was thinking, when I was listening to your presentation, I was thinking that we all have notions about these kind of social changes happening around them, based on, what we saw, kind of, a bit of data that we have sort of looked at and things like that. But definitely, I think it's a very complex social process that we have not really given great attention to. Because, my own field survey in the tribal districts of Gujarat, where we know that tribals are more mainstreamed. The tribals of Gujarat are not like the tribals of maybe Bihar or any other place, or Odisha. That extent, they're much more politically mainstreamed, and everything. There, very clearly in districts where educational kind of investments have been made significantly, households have started looking at girls as economic investments. They're educating them, and and I think very interestingly, most of them are studying subjects like social work. Maybe they have seen a lot of NGOs working in those areas, and I think nursing, they want to become police. So I think a lot of other interesting that's also the kind of connection between education and education, work, aspirations, like some of these institutions. The households are willing to wait till the girl gets a job. So some households tells you that, no, that it's a husband's privilege, whether she'll do or not, but our responsibility is to kind of educate her. So something is changing because of some external kind of thing. So I think what my point is that maybe some of these counter movements, even in apparently micro pockets, I think are definitely leading to the story that we see at the macro level, where we often, I think your narrative was very important, because we have this very standard story of the minorities and the low caste people and the poor people are responsible for most of it. And the rest is okay, but it's not like that. Something else is definitely working. And the third point is, and I think about your very, very important things about the connection about migration and work, marriage and work. And of course, that involves kind of the woman moving out. I'm sure you know of this trend in states like Orissa, where younger girls are married and taken to Haryana. Many of them are going as second wives, and they don't even know they're actually being, they're not really wives. They're actually sort of agricultural hands, labor. They're going there to kind of, so there were a lot of stories at some point in time, and which is almost like forced marriage or trafficking or a lot of financial transactions get involved within this. So I think so marriage itself becomes I can see that the next point Ananya is talking about is from the plantation thing. I think, she would perhaps explain it there too. So marriage itself has become an institution to secure either unpaid, underpaid labor, and mostly unpaid labor, which also has led to a lot of, underage marriages or, early marriages, let's say, whether it is adolescents. So I was just thinking that, I thought it was a really mind-blowing sort of a, problematic that we are perhaps talking about, where a lot of social institutions and a lot of economic sort of, institutions changing are moving in multiple directions to create that outcome that we see. So I thought I must make that intervention. Thank you.
Thank you. Lot of questions there. So let me see if I can do justice to some of them at least. The first was very important question you raised about. Now I should say that we did not speak to adolescents. We spoke to women in the first 10 years of who had married in the last 10 years. The youngest of those were I think there may have been one or two who were 17, 18, 19. There may have been. Most of them were 20, 21, but looking back, who may have married as early as 14 or 15 and so on. So they were looking. So to my mind, the importance of what you're saying is that I don't think it's just the adolescent. I would say that women in certain stages of life, yes, the adolescent years, but adolescent years may be years of aspiration, as you say, aspiration, and they were willing to talk about their dreams, wherever those dreams may take them. Women in the early years of their marriage, let me tell you, whatever the current age may be, or even if they had married at the correct so-called later ages in their 20s and so on, this is the toughest time of their lives. They're at their most vulnerable. They are surrounded by in-laws. We had to find ways to talk to them when sometimes another person was present, and was almost impossible to sort of get to talk to them privately, because that might, and we were very conscious of A, consent, and B, not in, at least to the extent possible, not endangering them in any way. You don't want to have, you're walking in and you're walking out. You don't want to have a situation where they may be left even more vulnerable after you have left, right? Because here they are in their married context, their married homes. So yes, it was very difficult to talk to them. Some of them were extremely tight-lipped. If they were, we left it. Yes, silences sometimes spoke volumes. We went twice. We had a survey, and then we returned after some months where we chose women selectively to get as much diversity as possible for detailed interviews, which were mostly recorded. If they did not agree to a recording, we made notes. Sorry, let me just remove this. So it was a matter of rapport building within that context, recognizing the vulnerability of their situations. You have to speak in relationship to that. You have to allow them to be reticent. You have to allow them to not want to speak about certain things. You have to wait and see whether they will be more forthcoming, and so on. And so obviously, and we had quite large, to that extent, large numbers. We had, 200 plus in our survey per site, and so on. We could, we looked to those who seemed open to the idea of meeting us again and talking to us again. So there is no way around this, and I think we need to be very conscious of it. As researchers, the fact of their vulnerability was brought home to us only more by the fact of what they could say or could not say, or what they could say by indicating or they would say more about husbands or their home life in another context, and so on. So you have to find, you can't ask them directly, perhaps. So I think it's very important to pay attention to that and to work consensually with and around it. So that's all I can say. And we had young people mostly working in pairs in this interaction with them. You said about educational investments. That may be true in certain, far be it for me to say that more education is pointless if only because the data tells you that there are fewer women working gainfully at higher ages. of marriage. That would not be my point. Is not that. The point is that we have to recognize and address the problem. And so educational investments, if families are making them, then my only hope is that they will not be betrayed, that those educational investments will not betray them later, that they will, in fact, that the link between those investments and actually finding employment. That is where there is currently in our society a huge breakdown. There is no real link between the two, and the talk of skill development does not address it at all. So we have a huge disjuncture between education and work, employment. If families are in a position, or if there are programs at work, if there are actual, NGOs and other organizations on the site that are enabling not just the education to happen, but for the education to translate into gainful employment, then all strength to them is my answer. But sometimes my heart breaks when I hear programs for adolescent girls, which say where the adolescent girls stand up and tell you they want to become lawyers, they want to become doctors. These are in, remote Murshidabad or Sabai Madhopur, and these programs are there to enable these women to sort of have a stake in education. My heart breaks because I cannot picture it. I cannot picture these young women becoming lawyers and doctors until and unless there was a whole network out there that would enable that to actually happen and get translated. And so that is my answer there, that yes, indeed, we are seeing the massification of education happening today. So indeed, there is this huge expansion. What is it translating into is my doubt. The Haryana, let me just quickly respond to, time is running out. Haryana. Now, Haryana is really we have to be very careful here about what studies have been done and what anecdotal evidence we have. Haryana is infamous because of its low sex ratio has translated now into a marriage squeeze. That is to say, poorer Haryanvi men who are lower on the scale, are not able to find brides in their marriage markets. Those who are poorer, older, without work, perhaps with disabilities, are not finding wives because of the shortage of brides. And therefore, there is long distance, what are called long distance brides coming. And yes, very much. See, my point is a prior point. All marriage migration is work. Not just the Haryanvi long distance brides. Haryanvi long distance brides are showing up a larger problem. Even the women who are, the local marriage market is bringing in wives to labor in these households. So it's not uniquely true. There are wives coming from Kerala. There are wives coming from Bengal. There are wives coming from Orissa. And so on. And some of these are okay, quote unquote, meaning that they are not suffering, they're not being trafficked. These are usually dowryless marriages. These involve sometimes the families, the girls' families are coming all the way to Haryana. It's a very weird situation. You can imagine Malayalis and Haryanvis, their food practices, their language practices, you name it. It's a huge, huge issue. So yes, whether or not they're landing up as second wives, this I think is very, very rare. In a state where there is a shortage of brides, I would be very surprised to know that there are second wives as a matter of rule. And therefore, I think this would be rare, this kind of practice, because I have studied these regions in a different context, and I have colleagues who work on long distance migration, marriage migration. So yes and no is my answer to you on that one. I realize time is short, so.
Mary, we have a couple of questions in the chat box. I'll read out one and then I'll ask my colleagues to ask their questions quickly. Can we take another 5 minutes with these three questions?
Then I have to leave, unfortunately.
Yes, yeah. Ananya says, thank you so much for this. In my limited understanding, organizations in the space of rescue and rehabilitation work have increasingly been making a connection between elopements and trafficking. This trope is particularly used against marginalized communities with whom a lot of anti-trafficking and anti-child marriage interventions are being designed. Did this also come up during your research?
Elopements and trafficking. Okay. Now this is Yeah, this is a very important question, and I think we need to be very, very careful here. There is a tendency to conflate, just as there's a tendency to conflate labor migration with forced migration and so on, and trafficking. Trafficking is a very complex phenomenon and involves clear levels of deceit in terms of the reasons that could there be elopements that are actually trafficking? Of course there could be. Of course there could be a man who is deceitfully enticing a woman with promises of marriage, and she ends up wherever she ends up, okay? In a completely different context altogether, being exploited. It is possible, but I would hesitate to say that this is the pattern. No, in states like Bengal, for instance, where elopements are common. I mean, there are many states where elopements are common. In some of the northeastern states, elopements are common. And then the couple comes back. It simply means, it's simply a way of saying, we are married, this is our choice marriage, and then they come back. Often in states like these, they come back. They are more or less accepted by the family. So those are not the stories we hear of. So I am not trying to say that. I would therefore very strongly say that anti-child marriage interventions should not be justified as interventions against trafficking. Trafficking should be handled independently as a problem, not as a child marriage problem. Okay, because child marriage as a practice is much more wide. I mean, mostly underage marriages are happening between families. Families are arranging underage marriages. Okay, that is the rule. That is why millions of marriages are taking place to this very day. These are and these continue because they don't come to nobody's going to go to the law and oppose them, right? So let us be very, very careful and disentangle the different levels involved. Treat trafficking as a problem on its own, and not conflate it with the fact that somebody may be running away with someone. If that person is being tricked, that happens occasionally, yes. But there are many, many more elopements happening, which are elopements. And they may have their own issues and problems. They may be vulnerable. They don't know where to go to. They don't know what work to find. There are any number of issues that we must address and not conflate it with trafficking.
Shruti and Anurag, can you please go one after the other quickly?
Yeah, Anurag, I think your question was linked to Ananya's question, so maybe if you want to go first.
No, I was just wanting to ask that during our fieldwork in some of the southern districts in Tamil, like in some districts in Tamil Nadu, we came across incidents where there were narratives that linked migration, elopement, and early marriage together, wherein in a family where the parents migrate out for work, the young children are left behind, and the anxieties that surround the families of the young children eloping or love marriage, that actually led to early marriages. So I was just trying to ask if there are similar incidents that you came across during your work, or yeah.
There could well be. So I would say that is, in fact, it is the kind of vulnerabilities that surround a family that lead them to want to marry off their daughters early rather than wait till later. And one of those vulnerabilities could well be this pattern of migration, that they're going to leave the home and the woman is, but we may have that problem even without migration. If there is nothing but an elementary school available, the girl is 14 years old, she has finished elementary schooling, she's sitting at home, fears and anxieties start, developing regardless of whether they're present or not. The belief, the fear, this is a very widespread discourse, that if you let her be, if she will get out, she will move around, she will be made to fall in love with some boy and they will run away. This is a kind of discourse that has a very profound existence, whether or not there are actual incidences right around them, whether or not there are actual dangers, that, for instance, like the example you're giving, where both the parents are labor migrants and what will the girl do on her own? Isn't she going to be vulnerable and so on? So yes, until and unless we are able to address what is the meaningful life for young women, what are the support structures? We should ask ourselves, what support structures can be made available to young people at this stage in their lives, such that they can, find meaningful avenues of activity, including meaningful relationships, if that so happens, that may or may not lead to marriage. Can we imagine such a thing? We don't even think in those ways. We don't even think, and rural areas are particularly there in rural areas. I mean, even these young wives who are sitting in their homes are actually so isolated. They don't realize, yes, they fear the isolation if they were to marry by choice, but there is tremendous isolation in these families, right? And the places they can go to and the people they can connect to. What are the support structures that we make available in these contexts is to my mind actually the primary question.
Okay, this will be our very last question. Shruti, I'm cognizant that Professor Mary has to leave for another.
I'll just
Yeah.
quickly ask my question. Professor Mary, I was just curious about whether in any of your reports you also seen a correlation between migration for work and age of marriage, right? Like I personally have come across a number of longitudinal studies carried out primarily in developing countries that kind of attempt to trace the trajectory of adolescent girls who migrate for work, right? But the findings have largely been mixed. Like some of them speak about delayed marriage being a result of migration, whereas others talk about how migration is also linked to sexual initiation and consequently to teenage pregnancies and early marriage, right? And I asked this question mindful of the fact that the latter narrative might be a damaging one, but I was just curious if you've noted any trends in this nature.
I think, as I said, our study was not a migration study, but I would say it's a very mixed result. So it depends very much on the natal family. So if the natal family sees purpose and meaning, that is to say, you have the daughters, then this is more true in states like Telangana and Andhra than say in maybe in Bengal. So they see the value of the daughter's work, whether as a migrant worker or whether as a laborer at home, whether in home-based work or elsewhere. They see the value of her labor for the family, for the natal family, in which case then the fact that schooling is very, that there's very little schooling, she may even be illiterate, or she may have primary schooling or whatever. She is then seen as a laborer who contributes to the household, and her marriage is deferred. I mean, her marriage happens as and when it is time for that to happen. So there is no pressure that she marry early. In fact, in some cases, she may be marrying later. It is in context. That is maybe why states like Bengal are so static, show very little improvement in terms of underage marriage. There are no opportunities outside of once elementary schooling, which is free and provided by the government. Once that is over, there is nothing after that. There is no labor opportunity. There is no gainful work for her. And therefore, the idea of this woman, the young girl at home, creates the situation where it is time then to marry her off for everyone's, to get that part of her life over and done with and that responsibility over and done with. So it can work both ways. On the other hand, you can have situations where perhaps the pressure to migration can also lead to wanting to have an early marriage and ensure that then she's the responsibility of the other family, whether they migrate as a family or not. So I think it's a mixed answer, and I therefore don't see this can work either way. And we need to look much more closely, therefore, at the local levels and others to see what are the patterns involved. And my point would be to say that we should imagine forms of gainful labor, which we don't have in our country yet, where the idea that a young woman does some amount of schooling or education, then moves into gainful employment for some years. This is the pattern across the world. This is not the pattern here. The idea that these could be stages in life such that marriage happens after experiences, that the meaning of education of whatever level means some sort of job, whether it's in China, whether it's factory work or whatever it may be work that is considered, no great work at all, but nonetheless, it is in place. It is in place, and we have a working population of women. In India, we don't have that kind of working population of women to speak of. We have all these isolated pockets here and there where women are working, but we don't have we have mass education, but we don't have the idea that, working as such is worth it and something that all young people should be engaged in prior to the decision of whether to marry or not. That is something we don't have. So I don't know if I've answered your question. Now.
I hope there are no more pressing questions, but thank you for opening up a range of thoughts and questions that we will get back to you with, and we'll hope this conversation will carry forward. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you to all the participants for staying back till the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.